Hello everyone, and welcome to Meirc's webinar titled Public Sector Strategies, 7 Steps to Achieve Outstanding Performance. Thank you for joining us today. I see the chat board is already active and I appreciate that. Welcome to everyone who has joined us. The focus for today is the public sector, an area that I'm personally very passionate about. My name is Mohamed Alsinnawi, and I'm excited to share with you today takeaways and experiences from the number of years I have working as a consultant with public sector clients in the region, where I help them develop strategies that work. Today we will focus on the public sector. We will focus on the strategic management cycle in the public sector, and I will let you in a few secrets of the trade on how to make the strategy management process work perfectly for you. Over the next 30 minutes, I will go over a number of slides, after which I will open the floor for your questions. So please bear with us. Inshallah, towards the end, we will be able to answer most, if not all, of your questions. In the meantime, you have in front of you the chat area, which I've seen some of you have already utilized. Please feel free to type any question you have, any comment you have as I speak in the chat window in order for us to capture this input and use it towards the end after the 30 minutes is over to answer everything that you have asked. Let's get started. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. Again, my name is Mohamed Alsinnawi, and my career have taken me from being an electrical engineer in the past. I've started in the engineering profession to the management side of things, where for around 8 years now, I continue to advise and consult for public and private sector leaders, initially in North America and most recently in the GCC, where I help them and their organizations build solid strategies that can be adopted and sustained into the future. The most important finding from my years of experience with the public sector in the region is the fact that everyone I speak with tells me that no more do fancy strategy documents, typically, unfortunately, developed by external players, no more these documents are enough to impress. Rather, a clear execution framework is needed and is expected to be in place. So we need to move from strategic planning, from putting strategies that look great on paper, to things that could be executed by the teams and the available personnel on the ground. That is an important part of the work that any strategist needs to look at, and which we will talk about over the next few minutes together. So let me introduce you about the agenda for today. There are 3 key elements, 3 agenda items that I'd like to discuss with you today, that I will cover. First of all, we will work together to answer the question, what is public sector strategy? And one important discussion point that we will have there is to discuss the similarities or difference between the public sector and private sector when it comes to strategy. I will then go through 7 key steps in the strategy management process. So after we define what strategy is, I will show you a framework that is used by many organizations to describe and really utilize strategic thinking and planning into an understandable framework. Finally, and to link it all together, I will tell you a story about how Singapore used a similar strategy framework to move from a fully import-dependent country in its water resources. As we all know, water is a resource of great importance to any nation. They moved from being dependent externally on this resource to actually having the vision of becoming fully sufficient in the future. This example will show you that even though impact and results in the public sector takes a long time, yet with diligent pursuit, with proper strategic planning, proper execution of the strategy, and of course, proper monitoring and measurement, all organizations within government can get to that ambition. In order to get us started on the discussion and the topic of public sector strategy, I would like to present you with a question. You will see in front of you a poll, a small question that I'd like to ask you about your opinion on the differences or similarities between public sector strategy and the private sector. If you can kindly use the screen in front of you to answer one of the following 4 options. You think that the 2 types of strategies are completely different. Maybe you think that they are somewhat different, but there are similarities. Maybe you think they are completely the same. Strategy in the private or the public sector doesn't really differ. Or if you're not sure, of course, that is okay. Of course, there are no right or wrong answers here. This is just, to me, to show that we all have different opinions around the topic and try together to come up with a comprehensible solution and discussion of similarities and differences. Let me now, if everybody has entered their answers, to show you within our group, what the results look like. So as you can see in front of you, we are not in agreement on this. And that is okay. A number of us think that there are complete differences between the public and the private sector. Some of us feel there are differences, and however, some similarities, and some of us feel they're the same. What I want to tell you, and from my humble experience in the field, is that at the abstract level, at the higher level of the concept of strategy, private and public sector organizations do the same thing. The frameworks are the same. However, the environment which each of these entities operate in, the details around putting the right execution mechanisms, the complexity of the environment, both internally and externally, dictates certain differences. Let's now look together. Thank you for your input. Let's now look together at what and how we may be able to define public sector strategy. This is a definition that I really like, which is really straightforward and is succinct in many ways. The definition of public sector strategy in this one example is a fact that it's a planned series of choices taken by government to maximize public value and to achieve its ambitions. Now let us look at a couple of keywords within this definition. I think that they tell the whole story. The first one is the word choices, the idea of choices. We all know that in our governments, in governments around us, we always work with limited set of resources, limited set of financial, human, technological processes, resources that are not there in abundance. While at the same time, there are competing priorities for me in the public sector. There are requirements from my citizens to look at healthcare, to look at education, to look at the economy. The proper understanding of strategy is to really choose, first of all, understand these choices, understand what are the priorities that I have, and ensure that the money and the resources are spent on the right set of priorities. In turn, this gives us an indication into the second statement within the definition, which is the idea of public value. Many academics struggle to define public value. To me, to make it very simple, public value is about giving what the citizens, the visitors, the customers of the government, what they need in terms of high quality service in the most efficient and effective way. And really understanding what those expectations and what those services really mean to those customers. Doing this properly, making the right choices, focusing on the right priorities, will lead governments to achieve its ambitions. With this in mind, we can now start to look at the differences that exist between the public sector and the private sector. You've told me most of us think there are some similarities, yet there are differences. Simply, in my mind, there are a couple of dimensions that make the two sectors differ in their strategic dimension or the strategic thinking idea. The first one is around the ability for the public sector or government to impose and use the regulatory dimension in their execution. In addition to creating projects and making initiatives that work towards the betterment of society and citizens, governments also have the regulation lever, laws, regulations, policies that really impact and control areas where society works and thrives. For example, laws around how the stock market should work, laws around healthcare, laws around regulation. We are faced with these on a daily basis. At the same time, the other difference between public and private sector entities is the idea of focus on outcomes versus outputs. Citizens or society doesn't really care about how many police patrol cars are in the streets. And when it comes to security and safety, what they care about is the outcome of that. What are these police patrol cars helping me to achieve? In many ways, for example, in this scenario, it's about reducing crime rates. And as you can imagine, reducing crime rates in society takes a very long time. I cannot sense it in a day or a month or in 3 months. So governments cannot focus on short-term outputs, the buying of the patrol cars. Rather, they need to focus on the long-term outcomes. In the private sector example, profits and financial objectives are usually the most important priorities for the company. And those are usually a direct result of actions that organizations take. We can call these outputs. Shorter term, the focus for shareholders and stakeholders around the company is typically focused on financial aspects. So you can see that with so much of a larger number of stakeholders interested in the work of the public sector, with the long-term expectations that exist, the complexity of the public sector continues to be much more than that of the private sector. Now let's look briefly at this framework that I've been telling you about. We now see that there are differences. We now see that there's complexity involved in strategy management in the public sector. How can we put it all together in simple steps in order to ensure strategy management, the way governments operate, is well regulated and there's execution elements in place? There are 7 steps, from my experience, that any organization in the public sector can achieve. First of all, is the idea to understand your stakeholders and what they need, which is at the tip of the pyramid. There's also the idea, once you understand what stakeholders need, to start answering 2 questions as an entity. What do I want to do? What's my mandate as an entity, which is usually through the strategy management process, and then the how I want to achieve it. What policy levers and choices do I need to make in order to be successful? Once those 2 questions are answered, public sector entities can now move into the execution mode and really start thinking about initiatives that they want to execute and partnerships that they want to create. Public sector entities do not work on vacuum. They need others to support them, especially if problems like the one we discussed, crime rates, or be it healthier population, or be it better economy, requires a collaboration of many entities. At the bottom of the pyramid, at the base of the pyramid, there needs to be continuous performance management. This is about putting in the right key performance indicators, proper targets, and mechanisms for collaboration to ensure performance is always improved. The final step within this framework is to make sure that the front line has the opportunity to feedback and improve the execution through the ranks and the hierarchy of government, which means that things happening on the ground on a daily basis is fed back to the leadership to ensure that the strategy is still concurrent and is refreshed effectively. Let's now look together at a couple of great examples where governments and nations have put in ambitious objectives, ambitions, visions for their people to try to achieve. This is the tip of the pyramid. A great example is the United Arab Emirates, where the country has decided to be among the best countries in the world by 2021. This strategy was set forward in the past couple of years, and it's a very ambitious target that all organizations within the federal government of the UAE are working together to try to achieve. You can imagine that with this vision, there's a lot of responsibility and there's a lot of pressure for everyone to work towards that great ambition. The other example I want to share with you is Singapore. Back in the 90s, a big expat population was coming into Singapore, and many of them were seeing the country as a temporary place for residence. The government realized that and put in a vision to ensure that people coming to Singapore see the country more of a home rather than a house, and in turn will be there with their children for generations to come to build and improve the country. With that, Singapore has proven that this vision is actually working and has been executed since the 90s. They continually rank in the top positions in places like the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business and many other economical rankings globally. Now, the other question that should be asked after visions are set are the understanding that strategic themes, specific things where the government should prioritize itself on. And I want to share with you the example of competitive nationals or human capital development. I want to zoom in with you on that piece, that strategic theme at a national level. People within any community expect government to support them across their life cycle. So in the picture in front of us, you see that as babies, as toddlers, and as schoolgoers, there are high expectations from students and parents about the well-being of the children. At the same time, once the child or the student leaves high school, there are multiple paths that exist for that person. The government is required to also facilitate that transition, whether the person wants to join university, go directly into vocational training and then employment, or jump directly into a career. From there, the ultimate outcome and goal becomes a globally competitive national population in their chosen area of personal fulfillment. You can imagine the cycle of many years requires a lot of work by the government to facilitate and support. Not only that, once the person is ready for retirement, a good government, a good jurisdiction will allow its people to give back as retirees with the many number of years of experience that they've accumulated in their careers. This presents what we discussed earlier about the understanding of what inputs exist within a strategic theme, what are the outputs that are expected from there, and what are the final outcomes that are expected, in this instance, from a human capital development purpose, all linked to what the government does on a daily basis. I want to now turn your attention to an example where strategic objective in the UK, this is a Department for Education strategic objective, translated into policies, translated into executionable pieces on the ground. Let's now look together at this example, which is a strategic objective that says to increase the number of high-quality schools and introduce fair funding in the UK system. Now, this is, of course, an ambitious target where the UK has seen some issues, some challenges in that regard. Now, a few policies have been adopted to achieve this strategic objective. I'll display 3 of them for you. One of which, the idea of converting poor schools that are not producing the effective educational results into academy status. So the idea here is to give the opportunity for independent people from outside or private organizations to sponsor certain schools, sub-fund them partly, and at the same time get some control over the strategy of the school, thus by raising the caliber of the school and their academic performance. The other option they are looking at is which they started actually implementing, is the idea of free schools in poor areas. At the same time, a third option that has been selected is to fund poor students directly. As you can imagine, these policies took a long time to be created, but at the same time, the three of them together try to achieve the strategic objective, and the outcome will be a long-term one that takes time to be seen. Now, I would like to also pass it on to you and ask you a second set of questions. This question is about execution, which is the area we have started discussing with the UK example. Now, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to execution? You know, there are a number of studies that talk about this. I'm sure you have seen some of these in your day-to-day life. We all have. And I'd like your input to tell me, out of the options you have in front of the screen, what do you think is an issue, the biggest issue, when trying to execute strategy? Is it about measurement? You know, I cannot measure my strategy. Is it about accountability? No one is taking responsibility for what needs to be done. Is it about making strategy meaningful for the frontline people, for the people on the ground? Do you see a linkage between what people are doing day to day to the actual overall strategy? Is it about the problem of focusing on the short term? Remember the output-outcome discussion. Are we talking about just investing in new projects without thinking about the long term, or is it the other way around? Is it a problem with leadership? Or is it the fact that too many things are requested and there's not enough time to execute? And finally, is it just as humans, we have the nature to resist any change that comes our way, which is also sometimes an issue. Now let's see, I believe everybody, if you can kindly enter your answers to share the results. Let's see what you have been telling me. And the answers really are very interesting. The highest three areas where you think execution is challenged is through accountability, weak leadership, and resistance to change. At the same time, mostly all of these areas took center stage in your answers. Thank you for your input. This is very valuable. I want to show you now what Harvard has done in this regard and what their survey in 2010 of over 1,000 participants have shown. Of course, there are no wrong or right answers here. All of these are big obstacles. However, when they did their survey, similar to our survey now, they found out that people believe that one of the main problems that we have is the fact that strategy doesn't mean much to people on the front line. Strategy is typically done in a boardroom setting where senior leadership is sitting discussing it, while people that are working in the front line, middle management, professionals in their day-to-day work, do not know the results of the strategy, do not see how that impacts their day-to-day life, which means that there's a barrier to communication that exists between the hierarchy of the organization. The other one, which you actually talked about, the other two, if I may, is the idea of accountability, where if you have objectives that are not set directly to a specific person, things do not move. At the same time, of course, leadership issues and lack of measurement also come up as high answers from the different surveyed people. Now, the idea of measurement is very important. It's about really putting the right KPIs, the right areas where you want to ensure you are on the right track to succeed. A person driving the car always monitors the speed of the car. They always monitor the oil situation in the car or the gas value of the car as they drive. Without that, either the car will break down or will never reach its destination. Measurement is also about this issue. The third piece that exists here in the orange bubble is the idea on the short term. Unfortunately, as human beings, we'd like to see the results fast, and we like to see it when we are around. It's just human nature when people's expectations are driven by the day-to-day pains. Long-term strategies, long-term policies sometimes are not very popular with the population, which means that you need to make certain trade-offs to balance what's expected of you in the short term versus the long term. Now, as I promised, I want to conclude with you in discussing a great example of where this, this whole framework, the 7 steps, and the execution piece that we have discussed have actually worked very well. This is the Singapore strategy on water, which I believe is a great successful story. As many of you know, Singapore is a small nation with scarce resources. From a water perspective, it has barely any natural water reservoirs. There are no lakes, rivers, etc. in the country. And at one point in the 60s, it was importing more than 80% of its water needs. As we said earlier, water is one of the key ingredients to a prospering society. It's one of the basics of the requirements of human beings. They decided at that point, they were importing a lot of that water from Malaysia, that they need to become self-sufficient in water. And they came up with what they call the 4-tap strategy. And they put in key performance indicators, measures with specific targets to move away from this importing strategy, importing activity, to actually creating some way resources of water within the country. Let's look at the 4 steps or 4 legs of this strategy. The first one is about local catchment. They said, even though they don't have any natural reservoirs, they created 2 separate systems to collect rainwater. So they're able to harness the power of rain and any used water that may spill over. This rainwater is collected through a comprehensive network of drains, canals, rivers, ponds, water supply. With this capability, they manage to today get 20% of their water requirements, water demand, from catching rainwater. Singapore today is considered one of the few countries in the world to harvest this urban stormwater on a large scale for its water supply. So they're already innovators, they have intellectual property around that, and other countries come to them for education and for experience. The other important piece that they focused on is what they call new water, which is the idea of creating high-grade reclaimed water from treated used water, which they purify using advanced membrane technologies and ultraviolet disinfection, making it ultra clean and safe to drink. And the third, or the new tap strategy that they have is desalination, where Singapore actually uses a less energy intensive mechanism to desalinate seawater by idea of reverse osmosis, where it has one of the largest seawater plants in Asia. As you can see today, Singapore, and I said this started in the 60s, from 80% imported water, they now move to 40%, and in the future, as I will show you now, this will actually go down to 0%. In 2060, Singapore wants to be completely independent in its water resources, moving the requirement for water to local catchment, water that is driven from recyclement and desalination of seawater. With that in mind, folks, I would like to end the discussion. I'm now ready to look at your questions. I know some of you have been typing them in the chat window. And thank you very much for your focus and attention with me. One question I see, and feel free to continue, of course, to ask these questions. I'll just start looking at a couple that I see here. One question that you are asking me is recommendations to assess the impact of public sector strategy initiatives. This is a great question, and it really builds in the core of our presentation or webinar today. At the execution level, there needs to be measurement, and there needs to be this assessment of impact as you ask. Of course, the most important way to actually manage and measure impact at the execution level is, first of all, to design the right KPI system or measurement system. Once the right KPIs are there to measure initiatives, usually it revolves around budget, achievement of budget, and achievement of timelines and schedules. The idea then is to have a whole process that revolves around managing the performance. So if I've planned well for my initiative, I know how much it's going to cost me and how much time it will take. I've involved all the right collaborative partners with me to actually try to achieve this initiative and its goals. The idea then is to have, with the right KPIs, discussions between the different entities involved in the initiative in trying to achieve the right outcome. For instance, one initiative that usually exists in many jurisdictions, many countries these days, which is something that everyone is struggling with, is child obesity. Child obesity could be an issue that sits with the Ministry of Health, naturally. However, children are not really the responsibility of the Ministry of Health on a day-to-day basis. They go to schools, they go to recreational facilities run by the government, they sit with their families at home, and that's where their eating habits and their healthier habits can be produced. So an initiative to tackle child obesity that is led by the Ministry of Health needs the support of entities like the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Culture and Youth, etc., etc. Creating the right platform to have the right discussions about the problem, discussing the right measurement techniques will enable a government to tackle such a big and important issue. Now, another question I see here is the question of any special notes on developing strategic objectives and KPIs in the public sector. Of course, as you know, and you probably see in front of you here, Meirc, we have actually a course, a program, a 5-day program that tackles exactly this question, strategy management in the public sector, and uses the fundamental topics that I have described here today. With that, we go further in the exercises and workshop scenarios between the different participants around development of strategic objectives across multiple sectors, multiple public sector entities, and discuss in detail creating the right set of KPIs to be achieved and to be done around the different strategic objectives. Fortunately, also many governments around the world have online a lot of their strategic plans, which include objectives and KPIs that anyone around the world can actually tap into. And I suggest and I recommend you, if there's any specific interest, you can quickly do a search on the certain topics that will allow you to look into the different options. Now, I'd like to thank you. I think this concludes the questions that I see here in front of me, unless anyone else would like to type in any other questions. I'd like to thank you again for your time, and I appreciate you coming in for this webinar. I see that there are a couple of people typing in notes, so I'll just take a minute here to wait and see if there are any further questions. Of course, as we wait for the final set of questions, I'd like to remind you that a recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube page and on our website, and an email actually will be sent to you, people who attended. First of all, thanking you, of course, for attending, at the same time giving you a copy of this presentation. I'll be very happy in the future to get in touch and answer any more of your questions. And many thanks again, and have a great weekend and the rest of your day. I see, okay, before we conclude, I see there's a final question. And the question is, could you please give a short overview of what has been discussed as I joined late? Here's the thing, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a recording of the webcast, of the webinar on our website, and we will be sending you an email shortly with the recorded webinar. Hopefully that will give you all the details and all the elements that you need from what you have missed in the webinar. Folks, thank you very much again. Have a great day, and hope to talk to you soon in Meirc's, of course, future webinars. Bye-bye.
Meirc.com